The train pulled into Willow Creek Station with a slow screech, dust swirling in the scorching summer heat. It was July 1891. Off stepped a woman who looked like she'd wrestled with time itself and refused to give up. Her name was Clarice Monroe, 28 years old, barely 5 feet tall, with 2 battered suitcases and a letter that promised her a new life, a husband, a home, a future. What she got instead was a man in a greasy gray suit blocking the exit and saying, "Your husband died yesterday, but you still owe us for the train fare." Clarice froze, just like that. No welcome, no explanation, just a death notice from a stranger. "And those kids over there," he added, gesturing with his chin, "they'll be working off your husband's debts, seeing as they're orphans now." That was the first time Clarice saw them. 7 children huddled together on the porch of a rundown cabin, eyes wide, clothes tattered, fear stitched into every inch of them. The oldest couldn't have been more than 10, holding a baby like he'd been doing it his whole life. Let me pause here. Imagine you just rode a train for 3 days across the country on a one-way ticket, chasing a promise someone made you in ink. And before you even step off the platform, a man tells you your life's investment just died and left you with 7 mouths to feed and a stack of debt you never agreed to. What would you do? Cry, scream, walk away? Clarice didn't do any of that. Instead, she turned to the man, who introduced himself as Thomas Greer, the town store owner, and said, calm as sunrise, "Show me the paperwork." Greer scoffed, because of course he did. This was a small southern town, and Clarice was a black woman standing alone on a train platform asking for proof. "What kind of question is that?" he said. "My word's enough." "No," she answered, her voice razor-sharp. "Where I'm from, if you claim a debt, you show the ledger." She walked right past him toward the porch. The kids didn't move, but the boy holding the baby stepped forward. "My name's Sam," he said. "I'm 10. Daddy said you were going to take care of us." Clarice blinked, just once. That sentence alone changed the rest of her life. She crouched down. "Can you read, Sam?" "Yes, ma'am. Daddy taught me. I've been teaching the younger ones, too." Greer barked out a laugh behind her. What's it matter? They'll be picking cotton or scrubbing floors either way. But here's what Greer didn't know. Clarice Monroe wasn't just another desperate widow looking for a roof over her head. She grew up in Mississippi, daughter of a woman who turned 40 acres of swamp into a self-sustaining farm after the war. Clarice had spent her childhood learning how to read contracts before she learned to cook. And she had something no one expected. A sealed envelope in her coat pocket, wrapped in oilcloth, containing a notarized deed transferring full ownership of the Walker homestead to her in the event of Richard Walker's death. Signed, certified, filed in Nashville. She handed it to Greer like a poker player sliding in an ace. "This here," she said, "makes me the legal guardian of those children and the owner of that land. You want to challenge it? Go get the sheriff." Greer didn't move. He was calculating, squinting, trying to find an angle. "You're bluffing." Open the letter. His fingers fumbled on the wax seal. By the time he read, halfway through the legal jargon, his face had drained 2 shades paler. But Clarice wasn't done. She pulled out a second document, a bank letter from First Southern Trust for a $500 0-cents credit line, issued in her name, backed by property she already owned in Tennessee. You could have heard a pin drop on that dusty platform. "You came here thinking I was desperate," she told Greer, "but I came prepared." That's the thing people often overlook about survival. It's not about strength. It's about foresight. It's about knowing men like Greer will try to take everything from you and bringing receipts. Clarice wasn't just stepping into a trap, she was flipping it. And those kids, they didn't just gain a roof that day. They gained someone who knew how to build walls no one could tear down. Clarice Monroe didn't unpack right away. First, she inspected the house. It was small but structurally sound, with creaky floorboards, a busted back window, and the faint scent of mildew. But there was a garden patch that hadn't been completely overrun by weeds, and a chicken coop that still had potential. The kids followed her around like silent shadows, unsure whether to trust this woman who appeared out of nowhere claiming to be their new guardian. But Clarice didn't need their trust yet. She needed their truth. That evening, after she fed them a simple meal of cornbread and beans, she sat on the floor with Sam while the younger ones slept. "Tell me everything," she said. "About your father, about this town, about that man Greer." Sam hesitated, then nodded. He led her to a loose floorboard in the kitchen. Underneath it, wrapped in waxed cloth, was a small notebook and a stack of folded letters. Clarice opened the notebook and quickly realized what she held. Richard Walker's handwritten records. Page after page of itemized debts, receipts, and names. Greer's name showed up more than a dozen times, along with staggering interest rates and threatening notes about families that had fallen behind. There were even mentions of children being offered as labor to settle accounts. It wasn't just exploitation, it was systematic, coordinated debt bondage, targeted at the black families in the region. Clarice didn't flinch. She'd seen schemes like this before, hidden under fancy words like community credit or local lending. But here it was, in black ink, detailed with dates, amounts, and witnesses. Richard Walker had been building a case. He just hadn't lived long enough to finish it. Clarice ran her fingers along the last page. "He wasn't just trying to start over," she murmured. "He was trying to fight back." That night she couldn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table, the ledger open in front of her, the letters spread out like puzzle pieces. She wrote her own letter to her cousin Ruth in Memphis, who worked for a regional newspaper, and another to a law clerk she knew through the Baptist Women's Union. By dawn, she'd drafted 5 letters, each one a lifeline that might, if the right hands took them, pull the entire rotten root system up from under Willow Creek. Greer returned the next day, but he wasn't alone. With him were Sheriff Aldrich and 2 unfamiliar men, locals no doubt, brought in to add weight to the confrontation. Clarice saw them from the kitchen window as she folded the last clean dish towel into the drawer. She smoothed her dress, tucked the property deed and Walker's notebook into her apron, and opened the front door before they even knocked. "Morning, gentlemen," she said pleasantly, her voice warm but her eyes cold. The sheriff spoke first. "We've had reports that you're trying to claim property that doesn't belong to you, ma'am." Clarice stepped outside, letting the door click shut behind her. "Interesting," she replied, "because I have here a certified deed and bank-issued documentation stating otherwise." She handed over the documents one by one. The sheriff looked them over, his expression changing from suspicion to discomfort. Greer shifted beside him, clearly irritated the lawman wasn't reacting more aggressively. "And this," Clarice said, pulling the final piece from her apron, "is Mr. Walker's personal ledger. It details 5 years of illegal lending practices by Mr. Greer, including the use of child labor as a form of repayment." Greer exploded. "Lies! That man was barely coherent the last few months of his life. Nothing in there means a thing." But Sheriff Aldridge looked pale. "That's a serious accusation." Clarice didn't blink. "And I've already mailed copies to individuals who can confirm its contents. Some of those families live just a few miles from here. I imagine once they hear their names and stories are written down in this ledger, they'll want a word with you too." One of the men behind the sheriff muttered something under his breath. Greer shot him a look. Clarice noticed. The cracks were forming. The sheriff cleared his throat. "We'll need to examine these claims further." "I expect nothing less," she said smoothly. "And while you're at it, perhaps ask around about Mr. Walker's sudden death. I find it odd that a man in the prime of life dropped dead of a fever just days after confronting Greer about his accounts." Greer turned on her. "Yeah, it's slander." Clarice didn't move. "No, it's a question. One that a forensic medical examiner in Nashville is already reviewing thanks to a sample I had sent from Mr. Walker's gravesite. Don't worry, I had consent. From the legal heir." The sheriff looked down at the papers again, then up at Clarice. "We'll be in touch." Clarice nodded. "I'll be right here, with the children, in the house that's legally mine." The men retreated, not quickly, but not with the confidence they'd had walking in. Greer's glare lingered on Clarice until she closed the door. Back inside, the kids had gathered at the top of the stairs. They looked scared again. Clarice took a breath and forced a smile. "No one's taking you away," she said. "This is your home, and anyone who says otherwise is going to have to deal with me." That evening, as she sat reading Richard Walker's letters by lantern light, one phrase kept echoing in her mind: "Prepare for the storm before it sees you coming." Clarice hadn't come looking for a war, but now that she was in one, she intended to win it. On paper, in court, and if necessary, in the public eye. 3 months later, the small courthouse in Willow Creek was packed to the rafters. People came from towns over, whispering about the trial like it was a tent revival. No one could remember a time when a store owner as prominent as Thomas Greer had been dragged into court, let alone by a single woman, and a black one at that. But Clarice Monroe wasn't there for show. She walked into that courtroom wearing a navy blue dress and a composed expression, flanked by the 7 children who had once been called orphans. Now, they looked like students ready for their first day of school, clean, pressed, and proud. Clarice had spent the last 12 weeks preparing every angle. With the help of her cousin Ruth, she'd pushed the story into Memphis papers. With her law clerk contacts, she'd secured 2 pro bono attorneys who were eager to dismantle Greer's entire operation. She didn't need pity, she needed justice. And that's exactly what she got. The jury found Greer guilty on all counts: extortion, illegal lending practices, child labor exploitation, document forgery, and first-degree homicide. His face crumbled as the sentence was read aloud. 25 years in state prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted, not in cheers but in a stunned silence that only truth can bring. Greer, once the most feared man in the county, sat shackled in his chair, pale and trembling. But Clarice's victory didn't end with Greer's conviction. The state seized his assets and liquidated them to repay dozens of families he'd exploited over the years. She used her share of the compensation, not for herself, but to transform that rundown cabin into something unimaginable. 6 months later, a polished brass plaque gleamed on the front of a newly renovated building, the Clarice Monroe School for Children. What had once been a place of whispered threats and unpaid debts was now a haven for learning, healing, and opportunity. 30 children filled its classrooms. They were fed, clothed, taught to read, and treated with dignity. Sam, now 11, taught basic arithmetic to younger students. His sister Ruth ran the small library built from donated books across Tennessee and Kentucky. Clarice had made headlines, sure, but she didn't crave fame. What she wanted was impact, and the world noticed. She was invited to speak at education forums, wrote essays for national newspapers, and met with lawmakers to advocate for fair lending laws and protections for black families. She testified before state assemblies and traveled across the region, sharing her story, not to glorify her actions, but to show others what was possible when you refused to back down. During one of those days, the town doctor who had initially dismissed Richard Walker's death stopped by the school. "You changed everything," he admitted. "You made people see what we didn't want to admit." Clarice simply replied, "I didn't change anything. I just exposed what was already broken and showed what it could look like if we fixed it." 2 years after Greer's conviction, Clarice received an unexpected letter. It was from Greer himself, written from prison. He apologized clumsily but genuinely. He claimed he didn't realize who she was. Clarice read the letter at dinner that night, surrounded by the children, now growing taller and bolder each day. "Hezzy didn't know who I was," she told them, "but he did. He saw a single black woman, thought I was weak, thought I was disposable, and that's exactly why he thought he could win." Sam, now almost a teenager, looked her in the eyes and said, "But he didn't. You did." Clarice smiled. "No, Sam, we all did." The school expanded, donations poured in, former students returned to teach, Sam became a lawyer, Ruth pursued a degree in education and returned to serve as headmistress. The original 7 children who once huddled together on that porch grew into adults with families and legacies of their own. But they never forgot the day Clarice stepped off the train and rewrote all their destinies with courage and legal documents. Years later, at Clarice's 60th birthday, over 100 former students gathered to honor her. They gave speeches, sang songs, and read letters from mayors, senators, and educators across the country. But Clarice's words stole the night. "I used to think the best revenge was justice. But I was wrong," she said, her voice steady. "The best revenge is building something so strong, so good, so undeniable, that those who try to destroy you become irrelevant. What Greer tried to do to us, that's a footnote. What we built together, that's the headline." 7 years after his conviction, Thomas Greer died in prison. The news came by telegram. Clarice didn't celebrate. She didn't cry either. She simply placed the notice in her desk drawer and returned to her lesson plan for the next week. She wasn't driven by vengeance. She was driven by legacy. And her legacy was this: a woman who took a lie written in a newspaper ad and turned it into a life of purpose, truth, and protection for those no one else would stand for. Her story wasn't about winning against a bad man. It was about creating a better world after he lost. If Clarice Monroe taught us anything, it's this: justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet woman with a pen, a plan, and a promise she refuses to break. And that's the kind of story we all need to remember.